Hi, friends. Thanks for joining us today on Dr. Mike Live. An ideology can and does survive its political manifestations. Have you ever considered that? Well, let me give you a prime example. The USSR, commonly known as the Soviet Union, died, but Marxism lives on in the United States of America. How's that for an opening line? I am blessed to have Diana West today on the show. She is the author of numerous books, but the one that we're going to discuss is The Red Thread, a search for ideological drivers inside the anti-Trump conspiracy. Folks, you have got to understand, wrap your minds around what has actually transpired in the last 3 years, going back all the way back to 2016. There was an orchestrated, at the highest levels of our government and beyond, an attempted coup to unseat, to prevent, first of all, but then to unseat a duly elected president of the United States of America. And I'm concerned that Americans, first of all, they don't understand it. And if they have understood that at any point in the recent past, they've forgotten it and they've moved on to other things. Folks, we simply cannot let this go. We've got to press the point. And so my guest today, Diana West, she has done that with a fantastic book, The Red Thread, a search for ideological drivers inside the anti-Trump conspiracy. Diana, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, you have done yeoman's work for a good number of years now. Let me, folks, go to dianawest.net if you want to keep up with Diana, with her books, with her articles, and what she's putting out. There's a blog there, and she posts regularly there. But you might want to go out and get these other books as well. And I know they're available on Amazon. American Betrayal, The Secret Assault on Our Nation's Character, and also The Death of the Grown-Up, How America's Arrested Development is Bringing Down Western Civilization. Diana, The Red Thread, you do a fantastic job of creating a timeline and following, really following the trail. Folks that were involved in this attempted coup, and we'll bring it all up to date, folks. We'll get there, but it goes all the way to the top of the Department of Justice, to the FBI. Even Mueller is. I mean, he's damaged goods and has been for many years, and yet people act like the report that he manufactured has some semblance of truth, and that's simply not the case.
Well, that's true, and that we could even start there. Although I will say he is not one of the main subjects of the Red Thread, because he comes in a little later than the events that I was tracking at the moment of bringing it out, just as his report came out. The Red Thread's a very short book. It's a monograph of about 100 pages, and it tries to examine the players involved by their own words and by their own writings. This would include, for example, John Brennan, formerly head of the CIA, who told us in 2016 that he voted communist for Gus Hall in the 1976 election. That would have been the American bicentennial, by the way, when we still had Comrade Brezhnev leading the Soviet Union. James Comey, who also, by his own words, in an interview as he was about to enter the Justice Department back in 2003 during the George W. Bush administration, he told an interviewer that he had been a communist. He considered himself to have been a communist as a student at William & Mary in the 1980s. So these are the kinds of things I was looking at that were on the surface, and I was attempting to pull these threads, as I call them, together. Just for a moment on Mueller. Mueller goes back a very long time in Washington circles, and certainly we can describe him as somebody who serves the state to keep the truth, really, from the American people, and that would be looking at his conduct during the 9/11 investigation, when it was his FBI that suppressed information about additional Saudi cells, one in Florida, San Diego, and so on, looking at his behavior on some of the other investigations he was involved in. Very political, very partisan, and yet he does have one of those reputations that the media continues to promote of being some kind of a straight shooter, and it's quite absurd, and it really is quite a travesty, as a matter of fact. But in terms of the original conspiracy that I would say Mueller is trying to keep under wraps, we go back to the very beginning when we look at what was the genesis of the slander against President Trump as having been colluding, so-called, that strange word that appeared in our vocabularies in the summer of 2016, with Vladimir Putin. Somehow this was going to help him become elected. You know, they never actually explain how it could be possible that somehow this would have even worked to make people in Wyoming and South Dakota and Florida and elsewhere actually pull the lever for President Trump on Election Day. But be that as it may, this was the big mythology. And it goes back to this notion that the Russians hacked the DNC, which is another one of these things we have to sort of uncover, and we see in the various reports that have come out, there's no interest in it. So the kinds of secrets that are still being suppressed are the kinds of things that really interest me. But I thought before I could even get to that, important piece of it was to try to understand what was motivating these people. Because as everyone knows, it's a hallmark of our government that we pass from one party to another on elections. This is our peaceful transition of power. Why wouldn't these people at the top of the FBI, the top of the Justice Department, just wait till next time? Why would they commit these lawless and indeed seditious acts? So this is kind of the questioning that led me to see if there was a way to understand them better and look for these answers. And that was kind of the genesis of this investigation.
Yes, yeah. And you start with Bruce and Nellie Orr, which
yes.
I thought was fantastic, because there are a lot of dangling threads there that you pulled and then tied together to show that, listen, this has been a well-planned, well-thought-out, orchestrated over decades plot to really unleash at the appropriate time. One of the questions, well, let me just let you explain, who are Bruce and Nellie Orr? Since I mentioned their names, who are they?
Sure. Well, they are the beginning of the red thread, actually, because when we learned about them, which would be in December of 2017, there was a Fox story that told us about this peculiar married couple, Bruce Orr being, at the time, the top career official at the Justice Department. Now, he was demoted at the time of the story, but he'd been that powerful, and he still goes to work at the Justice Department, let me put it out there. He was married to a woman named Nellie Orr, who, it turned out, was the senior Russia expert at Fusion GPS, which is the shop that created this thing we've been talking about for so long called the STEELE dossier, on the payroll of, we later learned, Hillary Clinton and the Democratic National Committee. So these are two very, very important people in terms of this entire scandal, this entire conspiracy. What was apparent to me was that while, you look at officials, a senior Justice Department official, et cetera, very hard to understand really what makes them tick. We can see their resume, we can look at their career, what schools they went to, things like that, but you don't usually get a sense of who they are. They are part of this bureaucracy. But Nellie, it turned out, had been a professor at Vassar in the 1990s, which meant to me that there would be a paper trail. So I could go and find book reviews, her PhD thesis, things like that, to try to get a handle on what Nellie Orr was thinking about, what really interested her. And to tell you the truth, I was shocked, truly shocked, when I discovered that Nellie Orr, in her book reviews that everyone can read on the internet, and they're quoted extensively in the Red Thread, she has great nostalgia for the Soviet Union of Joseph Stalin. Now, this is sort of so shocking that I need to just even elaborate a little. People will remember Stalin was one of the great killers of the 20th century, a very bloody century. oh gosh, they ascribe something like 60 million killed, according to in his dictatorship. Well, Nellie Orr, when she writes about this period, and her specialty is the 1930s, which is when we begin the decade in the Soviet Union with what's known as the Ukraine terror famine, whereby the Stalin's state, starved Ukrainians in order to take possession of their privately owned farms. He literally starved them by the million. Somewhere upwards of 6 million people were starved to death, many more millions displaced, and so on. Nellie thinks that there were very positive things, and she literally writes about the paradoxes of that period. She writes about, oh yes, it was wonderful. He was creating a legal structure, she writes, but he was executing innocent civilians. What kind of mind thinks like that? Well, it turns out a mind at the very heart of the anti-Trump conspiracy.
Yes, absolutely so. And you asked the question, Diana, why would a high-ranking Department of Justice official, and of course that's Bruce Orr, his wife with a CIA link, that's Nellie, a retired M1 or MI6 officer, the Democratic Associated Research Organ hired by Hillary Clinton and the DNC, why would all of these disparate groups, individuals join forces? What did they have in common? Well, the overthrow of the government and a duly elected president. Is that not the case?
That is the case. That is absolutely the case. And we've been able to establish through the work of Devin Nunes's Intelligence Committee, some good journalists, FOIA activity by Judicial Watch and such, we've been able to put some of this together to understand that these people were using the surveillance powers of the United States, the police powers of the United States that are there to protect us. They were using them against the political opposition party, which in 2016 was the Republican Party, then led by Donald Trump, the candidate, and this continued and certainly continues into his presidency. I mean, this isn't over. So it is a shocking development for Americans to wake up and find that people at the top of the CIA, the top of the FBI, the Justice Department, and we can't leave out the Obama White House, were using these surveillance powers against our political system. They made political disagreement into warfare. They made political disagreement impossible. I mean, this goes to the core of our existence as a democracy, and this is not just targeting Donald Trump. This is targeting the 63 million Americans who voted for him, participating in the election, and duly electing him, as you said. And so this is really a crisis that has yet to really be resolved, and we still don't even know who runs it, what command and control looks like. Is it in Washington? Is it somewhere else? Is it in London? Is it in Moscow? I mean, we don't know the answers to these questions yet.
Yes.
Maybe we never will, too, but we have to keep looking.
Yeah, well, one thing's for sure, Diana, we won't find out if we don't keep asking and pushing and pressing and demanding. Yeah. I don't think this is an understatement, Diana, but this whole affair with Donald Trump and Russian collusion and Mueller report and all of these things that we've just talked about briefly. We haven't even got into the meat of this yet, but this constitutes the greatest constitutional crisis that the United States of America, certainly in my lifetime, that I have ever seen. Government agents attempting to overthrow a legitimate election, subverting our court system, and exposing us. I mean, it's bare naked right in front of our eyes, Diana. If I'm overstating this, then please say so. But bare naked right in front of us, a police state, a tyranny, if you will, by those that have been manipulating things behind the scenes for decades, and they were forced to come out in the open. I think that we, the people, and journalists like you need to keep pressing this point as hard as we can until those that are responsible are brought to justice. What do you think?
Absolutely. And I think you are correct to say this is the greatest crisis in our lifetime. I'm afraid to say, or I'm not afraid to say, but I'm afraid it's true, to say that this crisis was a long time in the making in terms of understand that when John Brennan voted communist and was hired by the CIA, that meant that the CIA already was receptive to people like John Brennan.
Yes.
Ditto with James Comey. Ditto with all of these people who are quite subversive, as we find out, and in ordinary times would not have been given government powers. This tells us something about the subversion of our government before we get to 2016. I mean, this is very important, and it's also important to understand history didn't start with Barack Obama. This goes back even before those 8 years we had of Obama, and this actually speaks to the book you referenced of mine earlier, The American Betrayal. American Betrayal essentially maps out the subversion of our government, really, which began in a very concerted way and a very extraordinary way under Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the 1930s. And it comes about at a point where Roosevelt recognizes, gives diplomatic recognition to this bloodthirsty Soviet regime that Nellie Orr, 80 years later, finds so appealing. So when Roosevelt in 1933 normalizes relations with this revolutionary regime that 4 presidents before him refused to have diplomatic relations with, they believed if a Bolshevik regime that outwardly says we will overthrow you, they believed that was not the basis for a fair and free and just relationship, so they did not recognize that regime. However, Roosevelt did in 1933, and what that did in Washington was it opened the gates to communists, pro-communists, socialists, progressives, and the other names for these far leftists who don't believe in a constitutional government. It gave them free rein to enter the government, which at that time, as you know, was exploding. We saw the expansion of government in those so-called New Deal days, where the government, all the new agencies that were developing, it was like mushrooms sprouting around Washington, and those agencies were populated very much so by these far leftists, including communists and including Soviet agents. And this is where we get quite shocking, because at a certain point, after many years, these were able to be looked at and codified. And we know that at least 500 Soviet agents, these are not just communists, but Soviet agents, had entered into the institutions of government and environs in Washington, D.C. by the middle of that period, say by the 1930s and 40s. We already had this incredible critical mass of leftists and Soviet agents. So this was a recipe for subversion, and those agencies, those people who populated them, because we did not drain the swamp then, with all the different there were many points at which we might have along the way, we did not do it. Those people replicated themselves. And so this is kind of what we're looking at in 2016. This is not ancient history. This is a process by which our government has been essentially occupied. That's a word I use to describe what happened in Washington back by the 40s. And this is what we see. We see this move toward police state tactics when this wouldn't have happened with any other Republican, or certainly Hillary Clinton, of course, but when a man like Donald Trump comes forward, who I believe is actually the most anti-communist president we've ever had, someone innately anti-communist to a point where you see his agenda essentially reversing the communist project. The nation state is the opposite of global communism, and everything Donald Trump has tried to do, everything he's told us he wants to do, is all about reestablishing America as a nation state with borders and manufacturing, immigration control. He's being frustrated at every turn, but this is why he represents the biggest threat to global socialism, globalism, that has ever emerged. And that, I think, explains part of why you see these people risk everything in their conspiratorial effort to take him down.
Yes. Amen to all of that, Diane. And I think that also explains right now why the news media is doing all their hyperventilating about China. We've got to be careful with China. You don't want to rattle China. China's going to come against us. China's going to destroy America. Well, no, it's because our president is looking them square in the eye, and he's telling them things that they haven't heard before from many of our
Right.
presidents.
Right.
And those in the corporate controlled media don't like that, and neither do their handlers. That's, in my opinion, that's what's really going on. Now, Dinah, you mentioned FDR, and I want to just raise one point before we move on to the Orrs and their relationship with GPS fusion and the STEELE dossier and all of that. And I don't know if I read it in your material or where I found it, but it was a known fact by FDR and Churchill as well that there were American and British soldiers that were POWs in Germany and the occupied territories when the Soviet Union swept in and started establishing what became the Iron Curtain. And FDR demanded that our people be returned, and Stalin told him to go pound sand. Did you write about that, or are you
Yes.
aware of what I'm talking about?
Oh, yes. No, I did write about that, and I'm so glad to hear it come back from you. You've heard about it or seen it. I did recently. I did a YouTube with Stefan Molyneux about Memorial Day, and maybe you saw that because we did go through some of that.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, this is a the book is called American Betrayal, and Chapter 11 is actually devoted to our betrayal, our government's betrayal of our GIs, which is one of the least known aspects, certainly of our history, of our certainly of FDR's presidency. Now, he died at the end of World War II, so this carried on into the Truman presidency, but it was all of a piece. And yes, this is one of the great scandals on our escutcheon, and certainly something that Americans need to learn about, because it's terrible to be lied to, and it's terrible that these families were lied to, and this is a big aspect of that. But it shows how we've been under the thumb so long, and it's all part of a long process that went through the war. People think of the war as the good war. We were fighting Nazism, and yet our government was so subverted by these communists, by these agents. I mean, now we can actually identify so many agents, including right at the top of the White House, right at the top of the State Department, the Treasury, and so on, who were actually they were working for Stalin. They were not working for the American people. They were not working for President Roosevelt. They were working to help Stalin expand his empire. That's really what World War II became an exercise in. The war for these people could end too soon. They did not want the war to end before D-Day. They had every reason to want the war to continue to a point where the Red Army could get out of the Soviet Union. In other words, if the war had ended while the Red Army was still inside Soviet borders, which was way into the end of 1943, for example, well, it was a big waste. They wanted this Red Army to be able to sweep across Europe, which it did, and they also wanted China to fall into communist hands, which it did. And so you had absolutely nefarious, scandalous conspiracies looking at both theaters of the war as communists were able to influence policymaking, war-making. So when we look at what's happening with President Trump, there are aspects of this conspiracy that are unique, but unfortunately, it is not unique to our government in terms of the subversion that has been going on for so many generations now, and yet we are not conversant with these facts at this point. So when I wrote American Betrayal, even though I had a decent education and read a lot, loved history, almost was a history major, in other words, I took an awful lot of courses, I didn't know any of this. So it was a process of painful discovery for me in writing that book. And then when I was able to look at the Trump conspiracy, I was able to put it in the framework of what had gone before. And I do think it's linked. I do think it's connected. You see the patterns. You see the people. You actually, in the red thread, it's not only about the conspirators who are working right now. It also looks at their ideological forebears, people that were mentored them, as in the example of James Comey that you alluded to, and others, Minelli Orr, and so on. They go back in time sort of vertically as well as in our time, which I think of horizontally, if you can think of this as an axis. So it's not just in our time. We're looking at a generational struggle. And it's, again, not something we're conversant with because our schools have also been part of this subversion. Our history departments are just a waste, or worse, they're not just a waste. That would be okay. No, they actually are doing harm. And
Yes.
so all of this information is tough to present because it's like a new day. But once you kind of get the pattern and you kind of get your way into it, a lot of things do fall into place. And for example, I hear from readers all the time who are they kind of already got it, but now they really get it. So it is possible we can do this.
Yeah. Well, and you share about James Comey's background and his ideology and some of his professors. That
Yes.
I had not read that anywhere previously, and I thought, oh my, that explains a lot. But it also explains this. But I want to back up and go back to GPS fusion so we can explain some of these things for listeners. They hear these terms tossed around all the time, but they don't really understand what they mean. But we'll come back to Comey, because I thought that was just a mic drop.
Yes, thank you.
That was, oh my, that's why he can sit there before a House Select Committee and lie through his teeth and know he's not going to be touched because his faith is in his handlers. And anyway, I'll go on a rant. But what is GPS? what is GPS fusion, Diana? Let's start back there, and then let's bring it forward to the STEELE dossier and why that matters.
Yes, well, it's fusion GPS, and what it is it's a strange kind of business. Apparently, there are quite a lot of them now, but they are called business intelligence organizations, and they do research for a very pretty penny for corporate or political clients. This particular one was established by some former journalists who are very left-wing themselves, and this group became associated with Democratic politics. It also entered into an agreement with Christopher Steele's business intelligence organization called Orbis over in Britain. They have them too, and they actually had some sort of a information sharing agreement going back about a decade. Christopher Steele came out of the intelligence world in Britain. Glenn Simpson, the purveyor of Fusion GPS here, did not. He comes out of journalism, but they sort of tread in the same vineyards, if you will. And Fusion GPS was hired, it turned out. Now, we didn't know this for so long. If you go back to the beginning of the Trump administration, that January of 2017, right before the inauguration, you get this release of this thing called the STEELE dossier. It was named for this former MI6 officer, Christopher Steele. He would have been hired by Fusion GPS to kind of be the contractor on this so-called dossier of garbage about President Trump. We had to wait almost a year to find out before a bank finally unblocked the records or released the banking statements of Fusion GPS to learn, I think it was in October of 2017, so 10 long months, that this thing had been actually created on the budget of Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democratic National Committee.
Wow.
This same dossier, however, as people have probably picked up by now, was used by our government to get these spying warrants on various people connected to the Trump campaign. Now, the significance there is that this was not intelligence. This was not independently verified information by intelligence professionals who are not political, not trying to win office, etc., not trying to kneecap their opponent as the Clintons were. This was sort of dirt, as Devin Nunes will call it. This was just political dirt that was actually dressed up into something different to try to convince the FISA court, the court that gives these spying warrants on American citizens, the leeway to do that. So in other words, the entire investigation of the Trump team was predicated on a pile of junk.
Yes.
So this is very, very significant, but think how long we went. Trump's whole first year almost was spent before we even knew for sure that this was a political document. This was just a political game. We didn't even get the full story about how it was used until I think it was February 2018, which is when finally Devin Nunes, his intelligence committee's memo, it was a 4-page memo, was able to come out to the American people. This was directly declassified by President Trump. And if you remember the furor over that, it was as if we were all going to just go up in a puff of smoke if that thing saw the light of day. But of course, what President Trump's enemies were afraid of was that American people would say, hey, wait a minute, you used this piece of political garbage to get the FBI and the CIA to spy on American citizens? I mean, it's right there. I mean, that's all you need to know about the whole thing.
Yep.
That's it.
Yep, that's it. That's exactly right. Okay, so Comey is a lifelong Marxist. He is a communist trained in the ideology. Why don't Americans know that, Diana?
Well, I don't know. It's a great question. I think, well, there is a serious answer. Going back to this notion that I put out there, that there's a swamp that was created 80 years ago in Washington. It was a swamp of Soviet influence, basically. Yes. Yeah. And there have been successive efforts by very brave Americans who were demonized by the same people, their forebears, who demonized President Trump and his supporters today. They were unable to drain it. They made some inroads into it, but ultimately, over this period from the end of World War II going to, well, it's about a 10-year period, really, where they tried, where we have been trained to look at that period as, quote, the Red Scare, and that people were unfairly treating communists who were just free thinkers and so on. And, of course, people are familiar with Senator McCarthy, who's supposed to be the worst man in American history, whereas he was probably the best, or certainly one of them. Great patriot. Very successful. He was probably one of the most successful investigators, duly elected by the people multiple times, to examine communists in the government, communists in the Defense Department, things like that. This is what he was doing, and so he was given the Trump treatment, what we understand now as the Trump treatment, and essentially politically assassinated, really from about that period forward, and that would be, say, 1954. From that period until 2016, we've had very little in terms of trying to drain the swamp, because people have become so frightened of being demonized, being called a McCarthyite, or even to a point where we have lost our understanding that there could be enemies within, that there could be domestic Marxists who are trying to take away our Constitution and impose a socialist dictatorship. That was sort of wiped from our brains. We were brainwashed, and indeed, the best anti-communists of the next few generations all wanted to fight communism somewhere else in the world, but not here. It's like people don't even think about it here. It doesn't exist here. So when you say, how could James Comey get to where he got, given how he believed and how he even was open about it to a point, that is part of the reason we stopped having any sense of self-protection or survival instinct, really, in terms of wanting to remain free, and we just became subverted ourselves and frightened of the whole thing. And so when Comey told the reporter he'd been a communist in college, he was right about to become the number 2 man at the Justice Department under George Bush. This was 2003. For the life of me, I cannot find that anyone in his confirmation hearings even asked him a question about it. And this was in New York Magazine. It was not in some obscure publication. So it didn't enter into people's minds. Now, the reason that you can say you can judge him as a communist through his life, even though he's thought of as a Republican until very recently, is because his lodestar all these years, starting from when he was a communist at William and Mary in the 80s to 2018, when he talked about his influences the last time, I think, he has held in greatest esteem a Marxist type of theologian known as Reinhold Niebuhr. We only think of him as a liberal theologian. That's all I knew about him. I didn't know anything about him. But when you go back and you look at his writings, including the books that Comey holds most dear, he's talking about violent revolution. He's talking about coercion of the people to come to this social justice. He's talking about all manner of lobbying. He was one of the people who lobbied FDR to recognize the Bolshevik regime. He's one of the people opposed to any kind of examinations of communism inside the government, things like that. this is Comey's lodestar. And indeed, and I go into this, Comey wrote a paper about him, which I quote at some length in the red thread, so people can actually read these quotations for themselves. But I mean, it's really quite unmistakable what he's talking about. Comey believed, and he still does because he tells us so, he believed that it's the duty, this is Comey, and he's sort of giving you back what Niebuhr is teaching him. It is the duty of the Christian in politics to have no specific Christian politics. And he goes on, and this is Comey. He says, the Christian in politics must be willing to transgress any purely Christian ethic. He must be willing to sin in the name of justice. And when you get into Comey's definition of justice, you see redistribution of wealth. I mean, this is ultimately what Niebuhr is talking about, redistribution of power as done by an elite. I mean, it is essentially the Marxist model. And this is the man who ended up not only being number 2 at the Justice Department, but then heading our FBI. And I can only imagine that J. Edgar Hoover, who was himself a very strong anti-communist, was probably rolling over in his grave, I guess is the expression we use. But I mean, it really is the world upside down.
Absolutely, it is, Diana. Folks, we're talking to Diana West. She is the author of The Red Thread, A Search for Ideological Drivers Inside the Anti-Trump Conspiracy. But I also want to direct your attention to Diana's book, American Betrayal. It chronicles the lies of America's media and academia concerning communism. And since you brought Senator McCarthy up, I'm just going to recommend this book to you folks. It's in my library, Blacklisted by History, The Untold Story of Senator Joe McCarthy and His Fight Against America's Enemies. M. Stanton Evans is the author. I would recommend that you get a copy
Absolutely.
of this book.
That was the book that, yes, that book started me on my odyssey to writing American Betrayal. And I was very, very fortunate indeed to come to know Stanton Evans in the last few years of his life. Yes, he was a very great friend and a friend of American Betrayal. Also, he was quite thrilled with what I was able to do on his back, essentially, because it was his research in terms of overturning the what he called the court history on McCarthy, which is that he was just the devil demon dog of American history, when in fact he really was one of our greatest patriots, as Stan proves in the book. And but he takes 700 pages to do this really heavy lifting of detective work on McCarthy. He restores the archive. He makes it very plain. It's all there. It's all cited. But that was a big effort just with him. And when I looked at that book, I thought to myself, if you can do that with McCarthy, what about the rest of the lies we've been told? And so that really was my stepping stone into American Betrayal, which is, probably a broader canvas of American history, really from the 30s on to, basically the present, or certainly after the demise of the Soviet Union up to around 2000, or after 9/11, I guess. So it's a broader book, but I couldn't have written it without Stan Evans' book, Blacklisted by History. It's a continuing problem for Americans because, and this is something Stan talked about, almost everything we've been told is either a distortion, a lie, an error. It's bogus. He used the word bogus history. We make all of our lessons. We learn all of our lessons from bogus history, and that explains a lot of why we're in such a terrible predicament. We have to overturn this history, and it's something that I learned to do just by doing it, and others can do it too. And I always put a lot of notes, endnotes and so on in my books, just because I want other people to be able to look at it, and then lead them to other places, because there's so much to overturn.
There is, absolutely, Diana. Hearty amen from me. And this is fresh on my mind. Jared, we're going to let's play the promo for the conference coming up, and then our sponsor promo Works LLC from my good friend Shan, and then if you would be so kind while that's playing, if you would look up Social Injustice, the book. I want to promo that as well, because I just finished my chapter on that book, which is on progressivism, progressive politics in the church. And I actually went back to the roots of the social gospel and what became progressive theology, and how progressive, the globalists, yes, they were globalists all the way back to the turn of the 20th century, and foundation money, especially the Rockefeller and the Carnegie foundations, fueled socialism and gaining traction in America, but I don't want to give too much away. So anyway, we'll go to questions after the promo for the conference and after the works promo, Jared.
Hi friends, Pastor Mike Spalding here to tell you about the Go Therefore 2019 conference. This year's gathering will be at the University of Northwest Ohio Event Center, July 26th and 27th. The conference will conclude Sunday, July 28th at Calvary Chapel of Lima. This is the largest gathering of acclaimed Bible teachers, researchers, and prophecy experts anywhere in the United States. Here's our speaker list. Author, Bible teacher, and host of the Kingdom Intelligence Briefing, Dr. Michael Lake. Bradley Dean, host of Sons of Liberty Radio. Author and founder and director of Peacemakers Outreach, Dr. John Diamond. Russ Disdar of Shatter the Darkness Ministries. Coach Dave Daubenmire of Pass the Salt Ministries. Pastor and author Dr. Carl Gallups. Researcher Carl Teichribb. Publisher of the Wisconsin Christian News, Rob Pugh. Author Douglas Woodward. Prophecy expert John Haller, David Arthur of Alphabet Man Ministries, filmmaker Tom Dunn, researcher David Paxton, cybersecurity and artificial intelligence researcher Mark Trump, Created Equal founder Mark Harrington, The Last Evangelist filmmaker David Heavener, author, researcher, and lecturer L.A. Marzulli, author Chad Schaefer, British filmmaker Mark Sutherland, pastor and musician Leighton Howerton, former combat veteran and author Jamie Walden, and of course, me, Dr. Mike Spalding. Tickets are only $59. You can secure your seat for the Go Therefore conference at this website, gothereforeconference.com. This event will sell out quickly. Ticket and hotel information is at the conference website, gothereforeconference.com. Hope to see you there.
And family-owned and operated company that values made in the USA. Visit Works LLC, www.werkz.com, works.com, Works LLC, 855-937-5901, 855-937-5901, Works LLC. Hi friends, Works LLC is a
All right. Thanks for listening to those promotions. Go Therefore Conference, gothereforeconference.com. You can register there. That's July 26th and 27th. Please support Works. Please support Works if you're in the market for a custom holder, mag carrier, knife sheath, any accessories that go with that. that's what I carry. I carry a Works custom Kydex holster for my Glock. And yes, I'm a pistol packing pastor. Most of you already know that. But do some business at Works. Good Christian-owned company. Appreciate that. And on the book, Social Injustice, if you use the promo code Mike, M-I-K-E, you can get a free audio book when you pre-order the book. So that'll be coming out later this summer. So we've been chatting with Diana West. It's been a fantastic conversation, and she has really shed a lot of light on things that I know a lot of folks have been wondering about. Well, what does this mean? What is Fusion GPS? What is the STEELE dossier? What does all of this have to do with anything? And we've already decided, folks, Diana's going to come back on, and we're going to do this again at a later date so that we can really get all of this information out. There's just so much to try and cover. Kathy, do you have those questions handy? We've got questions from Facebook that we want to answer. Are you able to?
I can't find them. I lost my connection and I can't find them. So let me keep looking.
Okay, you keep looking. Vinny, you had a question.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. At 6:31, you sort of asked Mike, and Diana, fantastic show, by the way. Thank you very much. I really appreciate all the info. You asked, why don't we know all these things about all these crooks? And here's why. And it's been staring us on our faces all this time. It's this media. This media was in with Clinton and with the deep state all this time. They're never going to give. We need to divorce ourselves from them. We need to turn them off. They're never going to do our bidding. They're not they're not the watchdogs. They're the lapdogs of the bastards. So we just have to turn them off. We have our own media. I need to listen to. Forget these guys. Like this is what they did today. In a hospital waiting room, a helicopter crashes on 1st Street, 7th Avenue, and they stay with it over an hour. 3 different channels. Something else going on in the world, and the crash occupies his attention, and because the pilot died, just like pilot dead, helicopter. It's ridiculous. All this stuff going on in this world, they're not telling anything.
Yeah,
so let's forget them.
Yeah. Well, and
that's really true. Yeah.
Yep. And Diana is one of those folks we need to be paying attention to, as well as many others. So thank you for that, Vinny. Any comments, Diana? Yeah.
Well, yes, and I think it's even worse than that. Yes, there's the disaster distraction video that becomes wallpaper, as in today's, crash. There's something else. A journalist that I think I learned from. His name is Lee Smith. He wrote a piece a few days ago that's really alarming, and it's about all of the former intelligence professionals who now sit as newscasters or pundits on news shows or as reporters. This is a real scandal in the sense that they are former CIA or other intelligence agency people who are now essentially cannot be trusted to be giving unbiased information. We would have to look at them and assume that they are actually presenting the agency line or the intelligence world line, which is a deceiving line, which is a line intended to deceive. And these people have jobs at big cable networks and other networks. So this is a real problem. He wrote a piece called Spies Are the New Journalists. This is something very apparent if you know who the people are going back in time. Again, none of this stuff is brand new. We had all kinds of media over the years who were captive to the various government agencies, including the intelligence world, when they exchange information from these sources for shading the news, keeping certain things out of the news, protecting their sources, and so on. So that's why when President Trump talks about fake news, he's so very correct on so many different levels.
Yes. That's right. Denny, you had a question you wanted to ask?
It was kind of along with that. Diana, first off, fantastic show.
Oh, thank you.
second off, this information that you're getting is more affirmation of what I've been hearing and confirmations, but there is absolutely nothing on TV you can watch anymore.
Right.
I can't even
right.
watch Fox
No.
News anymore.
Mhm.
It's become completely left wing.
Yeah.
It really has. And it's all slanted. They make themselves sound conservative, but then they don't bring up anything anti-Muslim or abortion or homosexual, none of that stuff. You know
None
what I'm
of
saying?
that. Sure.
So where? I mean, you can go to the network. I mean, go to the internet, and then you got Looney Tunes in there too. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
And it's really, what do you recommend? And you can't wait for a book to come out. Then it's past tense on a lot of it. You know what I'm saying?
Sure.
So where do we go for our daily news? Where do you go for daily reliable news?
I go for news. I start news. I've created really what I consider to be my own wire service on Twitter. I know Twitter is not the answer because it's very far left. They're silencing conservatives. We need another platform. I haven't gone to this new one, Parler or Parlay, I don't know how you say it, or one of the others yet, but I keep waiting to be shut down myself on Twitter. But over the last few years, that was a very good source for me. And if you're interested in the people I follow, which would be people on the left and right, news sources, individuals, and so on, people that I might get an interesting feed of information and follow a story through, you can look at my own Twitter, what do you call it when you follow people, the people you follow. I'm at Diana lowercase _ West lowercase _. So if you're interested, you can see the kind of people I follow, and I do get more of my news that way. I don't read the newspapers the way I used to. I used to go through the Washington papers, the New York Times. I used to actually read them. Now I'll only read certain stories if I must, because I know they're so biased that I'm not going to be really getting a spread of news. So your question's really good. That's where I start. There's certain stories I would search, but now you can't search reliably because the algorithms have become so politicized. It is a real problem. Again, going back to the individuals that you sort of cultivate, you develop sources that you like. Hopefully they're blogs or websites that also aggregate some of these better or more interesting sources. So it really becomes a do-it-yourself project to get the news. It's possible, and you can get really good news that way, but that's kind of how I do it. And I would just say, speaking to what you were saying about Fox, you're absolutely correct in terms of those very important conservative issues. And even as strongly as someone like a Sean Hannity covers the anti-Trump conspiracy, what I find with him and so on is an endless dwelling on the mechanics of it. Every single teeniest little detail of the day becomes endlessly discussed over and over, and it becomes kind of numbing to me. And I had an interesting experience. For the first time in my career, actually, I went on his radio show, the Hannity radio show, a couple weeks ago, and the producer had led me to believe we would be talking about the red thread, which of course goes to motivation and this notion that this is a Marxist movement trying to take out our anti-communist president, basically. I mean, that's the bottom line. And it was interesting to me because I don't think Sean actually knew about any of this. And when he brought me on to talk with Greg Jarrett about the news of the day, did Trey Gowdy, what did he say about James Comey's emails to John Brennan? I mean, literally, it was just the latest little, breath on the actual scandal. And I got out there. To tell you the truth, I actually thought about, should I just quietly hang up? but I decided no, I would persevere and just put it out there. And I did get out there. The three details: Nellie Orr being a Stalin apologist or nostalgist, James Comey having been a communist in college, and John Brennan having voted communist. I did say you have to question motivation, and I just put those three factoids out there. Well, the next day, completely unconnected with, because those are just data points. In Red Thread, I do try to give a whole profile of these people. It's not just a one-off issue. But the next day, one of the larger sites, a thing called Zero Hedge, put out there, Comey was a communist in college. And then then Rush Limbaugh put it out there. And, it kind of went around at least one side of the internet, which was good. But what I thought was so interesting was, wow, people are really interested even in this one fact. There's so many more. I think people are hungry to learn the truth. And so, it's really hard to get past the wall. And it does become sort of left up to us as citizens.
Okay. Yeah, fantastic. Diane, a couple of questions in from Facebook. One, do you think we should be looking for a false flag to divert us from looking for communists in our government? Are they going to try to pull something to get us completely off of script? What do you think?
Well, I don't know that that's necessary, because I don't really know. I mean, we're having this conversation, but it's not really a threat at this point to unravel this as a communist conspiracy. That's pretty much taken care of. I mean, and I'm not talking about the left, look at conservatives who always go to the demonization of Joseph McCarthy in public life, and that includes the president, sadly to say, or his men, or his, the pundits and so on. So I think that per se is not a worry of mine. I'm just still trying to chip away out there at the nature of these people and why it's relevant. It's tough. People aren't that interested in it. One thing I do fear, and we haven't really talked about it, but one of my fears is that conservatives are relying very hard on Attorney General Barr to do the right thing. And what I'm hearing from his statements, my concern is that he is not going to unravel the real underlying scandal of the anti-Trump conspiracy, which is the creation of the hoax itself that Russia attacked our election. And that goes back to the DNC server, where you got the emails that showed that the DNC was favoring Hillary over Debbie Wasserman Schultz. We're supposed to think that was a Russian intelligence operation, but the evidence is not there. Mueller didn't investigate that. He just covered it up. And what Barr is talking about is how much he liked what Mueller did in his Russian investigation. And I fear that if that remains sort of the baseline of everything, it almost is an out for your James Comeys and everyone else, because if they put over that Russia attacked our election, and the subtext of that, of course, is that Trump is not legitimate, then anything anyone does to save the country, quote unquote, is kind of justified, even if they went too far. In other words, they were zealous, but they had cause. Well, they didn't have cause. This was a big lie in the creation of the entire hoax, and I'm worried it won't be uncovered. So is that a false flag? I mean, it's not really a false flag. It's a big lie. But notice how often it's repeated. This is something you will find at my website, dianawest.net. I will see that some of my more normal outlets are not picking up on that. They don't like what I'm saying about Barr, but I think it's just something to listen for and be cautious about, because you have to go back to that. And then at the same time, we've got WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange rotting away in a prison. Well, he's the man who actually knows who the source of those WikiLeaks emails were, the source was, and Barr doesn't want him to talk either. So it's kind of like, what kind of real big thing is being perpetrated against us, really getting to the bottom of who created this hoax.
Yes, yes. Hey, folks, guess what? Unfortunately, we're out of time. But hey, that was just part one. We've got part two coming at a later date.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned. Stay tuned for Diana West, part two. And we're going to get into all of this and more. Make sure you go to the events page on drmikelive.com, drmikelive.com. Check out the calendar to see who's going to be on the show for that particular Monday. And we'll get Diana rescheduled just as soon as her calendar will permit that. Folks, we would appreciate your support. You can go to drmikelive.com to the donate button, support there. Please go to to Diana's website, dianawest.net, and support the work that she's doing. Buy her books. They're out there on Amazon. You're going to get an education if you do. Folks, remember something. Renewing our mind is not an option. I'll see you next week. God bless you.